I'm just testing the clicker. Okay. Okay, hi. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm Sacha. I'm a researcher at Lido. I just recently read the blurb for the talk, and it's not at all what I originally set out to do, so I apologize. It's not as funny as I wanted it to be, and it's not as simple. So bear with me. What this talk is not about. This talk is not about making the case for no issuance change. This talk is about it. There are good reasons for that, to do with mainly neutrality, and I think like a pessimism towards attracting new solo stakers. But that's for another talk. This is really to try and find some sort of consensus, some sort of bridge between what Casper, Ansgar, and Anders are doing, and how, I guess, a subset of Lido contributors think about things. So what this talk is about, an attempt to find a synthesis as consensus that all sides can put up with. It does take as axiomatic that most EF researchers have already made their minds up on an issuance cut, although there are disagreements on the details. Okay, so what do we agree on already? I think we are all aligned that issuance should concern itself with like macro level risks to Ethereum. This is Anders' framing. If you look at number 2, there are sort of existential macro level risks, and I think that's within the scope of issuance to try and anticipate and fix. One thing that I think Casper touched on is the crux of this is having a viable social layer that's uncorrupted by any staking provider, right? That's ultimately what matters to credible neutrality. Okay, so where do we disagree? We disagree on 3 things, I think, right? The first is what the purpose of issuance should be, and this is kind of we maybe disagree. The second is our confidence in the shape of the long-run supply curve, and this is, probably disagree. And the third is the relative chances of macro-level risks under different issuance rates. And I think this is what we definitely disagree on, right? And this is the crux of it. So I'm going to present kind of one side thesis, the other side antithesis, and try and come to some sort of synthesis. So kind of the one side of the argument goes, not touching issuance at this stage increases the likelihood that an LST like Lido ends up dominating ETH as the most liquid and widely used currency within the ecosystem. This would make it much harder for Ethereum to recover if that LST were to turn malicious at some point in the future, much harder to fork something out that most users depend on. This is kind of like, well summarized by Anders here. A key reason for MVI is precisely because of the fear that all ETH would be staked when some black swan event takes place. And this is kind of a sort of a story mode in Anders' Twitter, which I think does a good job of kind of articulating that event. Okay, what's the counter? What's kind of the antithesis here? So the other side here is that cutting issuance increases the likelihood that a centralized exchange dominates staking. This could have dire consequences for Ethereum's ability to remain censorship resistant, and hence ETH's value. A Coinbase tailwind is increasingly likely given Trump's election win. There is now an increased probability of staking ETFs. So why are we considering adding fuel to the fire? But perhaps most importantly, even with less than 50% of ETH staked, a malicious Coinbase could prove impossible to socially slash. And to see this kind of small story, kind of inspired by Anders, but kind of the other side, consider the following, right? Okay. A significant issuance cut is implemented, let's say in 6 months to a year's time, maybe even sooner. With margin compressed and ETH staking ETFs given the green light, stake centralizes pretty quickly. Within a few years, over 50% of validators are run by Coinbase. 2030, the Dems are back in power. The US government puts a tremendous amount of pressure on Coinbase to refuse to process blocks that contain privacy-preserving transactions in them, or transactions from a continuously updated government blacklist. That could include human rights activists, journalists, whoever's kind of public enemy number one at the time. By this time, Brian is no longer CEO. He stepped down to focus on longevity research. He's kind of burnt out of all the politicking. His replacement is not as OG or aligned and caves in order to appease both the government and Coinbase's shareholders. Most of the Ethereum crowd is now on Farcaster. I don't know, maybe they already are on Farcaster. While Farcaster has been great for the ecosystem, its strong ties to Coinbase make it especially difficult for anti-Coinbase narratives to spread across the social layer. And that kind of has to do with how an initial network is seeded, right? If you look at, I'm not going to go into this now, but it does, if there's momentum with initial followers, and that's kind of hard to undo later on. Okay, major base and Farcast influence argue that forking out Coinbase at this stage would be extremely unfair to innocent users. I mean, you can think of I think Ansgar has mentioned teachers with pension funds, etc. You're not going to just fork them out and stash their ETH. So this leads to some sort of crisis, right? So you have on one side Ethereum OGs and researchers who are threatening to leave the project if the censorship doesn't stop, and on the other hand, you have these kind of Coinbase-aligned people that have a lot of social influence that say this is kind of a really bad idea for Ethereum. So the Ethereum community splits into two camps. A contentious fork occurs, and circle, surprise, surprise, sides with Coinbase. So at this point, you have two sides in their own separate universes with their own chains with no practical way of coming back together. Ethereum, a global permissionless platform created in part to be a refuge from nations and geopolitics, instead ends up cleaved in half by a large corporation that is ultimately accountable to its shareholders and government. So, coming back down to earth, what the hell is the point of all this? The point of this antithesis here is to show that it's too simplistic a view. It's too simplistic to sort of view the macro level risk through the lens of solely the amount of ETH tied up in staking, which is which is the foundation for a lot of the issuance discussion. One of the main reasons given for cutting issuance. So as we see, there are complex social dynamics at play here that are very difficult to untangle, right? This is one hypothetical scenario, but you can dream up, millions of them. It's not difficult to. So double-clicking on the Coinbase risk. Today, these stats are slightly out of date, but it's the largest Ethereum node operator. Nearly 15% market share, could be over 15% now. Staking ETFs likely to happen under Trump. There's a good chance Coinbase will call on the market here. There's, US-based custodians are more likely to be whitelisted. If we look at Bitcoin, 8 out of 11 Bitcoin ETFs use Coinbase as their custodian. This is a pattern that is likely to repeat with ETH. The switching cost of moving capital on-chain is extremely low compared to the switching cost of moving capital from an ETF/SEX. Which essentially means if staking yield drops below a certain point, on-chain capital will leave for higher yields in DeFi. That's unlikely to happen on an exchange. In more sort of technical language, centralized custodians are likely to have a much lower supply curve than decentralized pools. All this means that there's a real possibility that staking ETFs combined with issuance cuts, could think of this as an accelerant, leads to one custodian controlling 51% of ETH staked a few years down the line. If that happens, you can probably say goodbye to ETH's monetary premium. And since this custodian has a large, if subtle, influence over the social layer, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to fork them out should something go wrong. So before I come to some synthesis, right, I presented one thesis, short, because I think there's Casper, Ansgar, Anders have done a good job of presenting that well. I presented the antithesis in a long way because I don't think it's been presented before. Before we come to a synthesis, I want to do a double click on how a strong LST adds value to Ethereum. There are multiple lenses through this, but the one I want to focus on is jurisdictional dispersion. So almost 20% of lido-owned operators are domiciled in APAC countries. That's sort of Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, South Korea. And while Europe compromises nearly 60% of the total, 2/3 of these are actually non-EU, right? So this includes countries like BVI, Cayman Islands, etc. So 60%, in total, we have 60% non-EU and non-US nodes, which is a pretty resilient distribution, especially compared to an Ethereum without Lido. If you look at sort of a distribution of Ethereum nodes, you see a real concentration in the US and Europe, especially the EU. Sort of according to Ether nodes, like more than 66% of Ethereum nodes are based in either the EUS or the EU. So that's significantly worse than Lido and very prone to geopolitical censorship. I think if Lido's doing well, but if it can get to 5 to 10% representation from both LATAM and Africa, that would be perfect, and I think we should make that an objective. This is a picture from a couple of days ago from a Lido community staking meetup. These are kind of 11 leaders within the Lido community stakers from 11 different countries, all running their own nodes. Okay, so how do we find a synthesis here? I think we have to start by pushing back on the myopic focus of solo stakers. So, I mean, one way of looking at this is I agree with Anders' point, and his point is focusing on if solo stakers might stop solo staking to a higher degree than delegating stakers at some specific yield is more important than if they change modality. Yes, solo stakers are indispensable and we need more of them, but the overarching emphasis on this, I think, is missing half the story. And one way to reformulate this is we need to, if we care about using issuance to improve geopolitical decentralization of the underlying nodes, we need to pay just as much attention to whether or not on-chain delegating stakers might stop staking to a higher degree than those holding their ETH on exchanges at some specific yield. I know that's a mouthful, bear with me. In other words, the answer we're looking for really boils down to the shape of the respective supply curves of different types of operators in question. Again, technical jargon, but I'm kind of addressing two audiences here. This way of looking at things, I think, was extremely well formulated by Barnaby back in February. So the way he broke this down into the questions we should be asking ourselves, I think, was beautiful and extremely on point. Having said that, I don't think anyone has quite answered these questions, and there are different groups working on looking at the supply side, but none of them, to my knowledge, are actually specifically looking at answering the way Barnaby has framed this problem. And I think without this sort of analysis, we can't really be sure whether or not enforcing an equilibrium, according to, here I'm focusing on Anders' practical endgame, we can't really be sure whether this will have a significant negative impact on the composition of the staking set. Okay, so what's a possible path forward? I have 6 minutes. Barring enough confidence on the shape of the supply curves for different types of operators, one possible path forward, as I see it today, is to build off Anders' latest practical endgame proposal, which I think is actually semi-reasonable, very well articulated, very beautiful read, if anyone has a spare week to get through the post, but very inspirational for me in terms of seeing how his mind works and how he thinks. This is kind of how what he proposes. Okay, this is the initial latest proposal, where you never have a yearly issuance rate of more than 0.5%, and there are sort of these different curves that could satisfy this. Sort of the 3 X's on the bottom are, I think, his preferred curves, and then there's also like sort of a curveball solution. He outlines, well, okay, we could just cap it at 0.5%, sort of that flat gray line, and revisit it in a few years' time when we have more insights on orbit SSF and MEV burn. And as you notice, sort of they peak around sort of 20, 30 million ETH staked, and then they kind of smoothly descend down. And they do follow the current reward curve up to, let's say 10 to 15 million ETH staked, but then they diverge, peak earlier, and then come down. And okay, so I think to find a synthesis, we can work with something that is mostly aligned with this. Modular the constraint that we need to try to depart minimally from the current reward curve. And this additional constraint comes from three things. One, improving the geopolitical distribution of nodes should be a property of issuance. Two, the macro risk of a dominant coin base is at least as important as the macro risk of a dominant LST. Three, we don't have a good read on what the long-term supply curve looks like, even if we agree the supply curve still has some room to shift downwards from here. Concretely, I think this means finding a mathematically elegant curve that, one, departs minimally from the current reward curve up until this point. Two, has a good chance of keeping total ETH stake close to 50%. So this kind of, again, aligns. If we're going to find consensus here, I think one thing that is kind of axiomatic from the other side is that there shouldn't be another money that dominates ETH. And so if you're trying to adhere to that, you want to keep the total ETH stake close to 50%. And three, does not significantly increase the chances of cartelization. So that means doesn't taper too steeply, and that has to do with kind of the validated set, deciding to censor new deposits because as new people come in, their rewards, their revenue as a whole goes down. So you don't want this to sort of go too steeply. This is kind of like a really simplistic back-of-the-envelope sketch that has no mathematical properties at all, but it sort of kind of gives you an idea of, this is the brown line of kind of the design space I'm getting at here. Although there are mimetic properties, I think the brown line sort of peaks at 0.69% issuance rate. So there are ways of doing this that are not violating the mimetic properties of an issuance rate upper limit. Okay. Another possible path, simple, pragmatic. I think a way to thread the needle here is to add a fail-safe to the current curve. So in other words, to choose a reward curve that sticks to the current reward curve for longer until we get close to 40 to 45% of ETH staked, say, before dropping down. This can be either aggressively in the spirit of sort of Ansgar or more smoothly in the spirit of Anders, up for debate. The idea behind this is it acts as a pragmatic brake on staked ETH surpassing 50% of the ETH supply. So with the current churn rate limit, realistically, it will take another 4 or 5 years for the amount of ETH stake to reach 50%. So this wait-and-see approach would allow us to gather more real-world information on what the equilibrium is likely to be under the current curve. More information on what the sort of the long-run supply curve looks like before making drastic changes, which are inevitably going to be based on less than complete information. I think the more time we have to sort of get real-world data on this, the more confident we can be to make the change. Okay. And sorry, I didn't have time to sketch that curve this morning. But it's basically just something that follows the current reward curve for longer, then sort of comes down at 45% staked in terms of being a fail-safe to avoid worst-case outcomes. Okay, 3 questions to think about. I have 56 seconds. 1, what are the set of reward curves that could build off Anders's pragmatic endgame post while departing minimally from the current reward curve? 2, how steeply can the reward curve fall without significantly increasing the risk of cartelization attacks? Is this something we need to be worried about, given that the social layer can correct for it? I don't know. That's an open question. 3, what are the set of reward curves that could satisfy kind of the simple/pragmatic path? What are the downsides here? Again, haven't really discussed this deeply with the other side, so we need to sort of start a conversation. Okay, now I think you can all throw tomatoes at me. I'm pretty sure everyone from the lido side is annoyed at me, and everyone from the ETH research side is annoyed at me, but thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Sasha. Now the stage is open for questions. I think we should start with the first one. Do you agree the issue is not in the curve, but the fact we don't have a way to increase incentives to active participants, solo stakers, and reduce passive ones?
No, I don't agree. I mean, I don't disagree, but I don't agree either. It's one factor. But
why don't you agree?
Well, the curve matters a lot. But so there's, you know, if you could find a way to increase incentives to active. I mean, what do you even mean by passive participants, I guess? Whose question is it?
Whose question is it? Maybe you want to elaborate a little bit more on your question. Is the person still here? Well, if not, then we just go to the next one. Why do you think 50% of ETH should be staked? It seems a very high percentage.
So, first of all, I don't think that 50% of ETH should or should not be staked. I'm just trying, these are kind of not necessarily my personal thoughts, this presentation. They're kind of trying to find some sort of consensus. I think like the way you find some sort of consensus is to say, okay, the most important factor from one side is ETH should be the dominant money. The most important sort of factor from the other side is, hang on, we need to care about the geopolitical diversity of nodes. Like, how do you find a synthesis? 50% avoids having something else dominate ETH as money, while still like giving you the maximum room to decentralize the validator set. So that's all.
Next one, is there a technical solution to identify solo stakes? For example, some on-chain ZKP and preference them in issuance.
I'm not an expert on the latest there, so I don't know.
Okay, then we move on to the next. What do you think will actually happen with the EF decision?
Well, it's not an EF decision, it's a community decision, hence why we're all here. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. The decision would have already been made, and Ethereum would probably be worth zero. Not because of this decision being made, but because the EF, if the EF is the sole decision maker, Ethereum is worth nothing. So I have no idea what will happen, but it's not the EF's decision to make, it's all of us.
I think we still have more time. Should we also think of changing the entry queue to be closer and closer to zero instead of changing issuance curve?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Sorry?
Sorry, wait. Sorry.
Oh, stop letting in new validators. I think that's kind of dangerous because you have like, then you cement like an OG class of people that just end up, you know, living off yields forever. And yeah, I don't think that's healthy for the system. I think it needs to be more fluid. I mean, I think Vitalik had an idea if you were to cap, right, you could randomly eject and randomly come in. I think that's interesting, but I think you do need some sort of fluid movement.
Are there any more questions from the audience, which maybe you have not found time to scan it and place it online? We still have more time. Yeah, the gentleman in the white shirt has more questions.
Hey. The ZKP question was me. The technology doesn't matter, I guess. The question was, like, if one of the goals is increased geopolitical distribution and or just like solo stakers, if you are able to positively identify solo stakers in a non-Sybil way, then you could design the protocol that way. So there are solutions, I think, to this, like choose your stack, but there's like some way to identify people. So like, is that part of the conversation of, you know, preferencing that goal by identifying solo stakers?
I'm not sure if necessarily identifying solo stakers is part of the conversation, but like I think part of the conversation is how optimistic are we that we can bring in new solar stakers, right? And this is kind of like a higher level than that, but it touches on it. And I think like, I would say I'm like, Lido as a whole is very optimistic that we can bring in a lot more solar stakers, right? And I think like maybe, and I don't want to speak for Casper or Ansgar, but I think like the vibe I get is they're actually much more pessimistic about our ability to bring in new solar stakers, right? And so if you are more pessimistic about enlarging this set of actors, then you might be more prone towards reducing issuance than not. But I mean, people can disagree on this, right?
Thank you so much. Time is up.